The blood had already turned dark by the time Ethan Calloway kicked the door open, dark and dry at the edges, the way blood turns when it has been given too much time alone in a cold room. And that single detail, more than anything else, told him he was already too late for something, though he did not yet know for what. The apartment smelled of rust and old candle wax, and something sharper underneath, fear maybe, or the particular smell of a body that has spent 2 days fighting to survive without anyone knowing it was fighting at all. He had come here to destroy her. He had rehearsed the words the entire drive from Manhattan, cold, precise words about theft and betrayal and the ruin she had brought down on 20 years of his work. And every one of those words died in his throat the moment he saw her, because Claire Bennett was not hiding from him in some luxury hideaway paid for with stolen secrets. She was on the floor beneath a broken window with a curtain of frost creeping across the cracked glass, her back against the wall, a needle and thread trembling and fingers gone white with cold and blood loss, trying, alone in the dark, to close a wound in her own shoulder because she had been too afraid to call anyone who might be able to find her. And when she lifted her head and saw him standing in the doorway, she did not look afraid of him. She looked like someone who had simply run out of strength to be afraid of anything at all. And she whispered his name, just once, the way a person says a word they were not sure they would ever get to say again, before the needle slipped from her fingers and she folded sideways to the floor. Ethan crossed the room before he had even decided to move, dropping to his knees, pressing his own tie hard against the wound because it was the only clean thing within reach. And it was there, on that freezing floor in a part of Brooklyn he had never once had reason to visit, that the man who built empires out of certainty realized he understood nothing about the woman who had organized his life for 6 years. 2 days earlier, he had been standing in a tailor shop on Fifth Avenue, admiring the fall of a tuxedo he would wear in 48 hours to marry Victoria Ashworth, daughter of one of the most powerful senators in New York. A wedding the papers were already calling the Union of the Decade, and he had been so entirely consumed with seating charts and orchid shades and government contracts that he had not truly noticed, that his most trusted assistant had vanished. His head of security told him first, in the clipped tone men use when they are delivering news they know will detonate something. Claire Bennett had not badged into the building in 2 days. Her phone was dead. A routine audit of her workstation showed she had pulled a folder of confidential merger files the night before she disappeared. And Ethan had felt something in his chest curdle into something cold and final, a betrayal he told himself he had simply failed to see coming, because if a woman who knew his coffee order and his mother's birthday and the names of every board member's spouse could vanish with his secrets 2 days before his wedding, then loyalty truly was for sale to the highest bidder, and he had simply never bothered to check the price tag. He believed that all the way into the car, all the way through the city, all the way to the crumbling brick building with boarded windows and a single hopeful geranium wilting in a coffee can on someone's fire escape. And he believed it right up until the door broke open and he saw exactly how the woman earning a 6-figure salary from his own company had actually been living. And then belief simply had nowhere left to stand. He carried her to the narrow bed in the corner and waited for the ambulance with his hands shaking for the first time in longer than he could remember. And while he waited, he searched the apartment, not for evidence anymore, but for some explanation that would let him hate her a little less. And what he found instead cracked something open in him that had no name. in a drawer beside the bed, folded with the kind of careful precision of someone protecting the only thing she had left, he found bank statements going back years, every one showing the same pattern. A paycheck deposited, and then within days, nearly all of it wired to a place called Meadowbrook Senior Care. And beneath the statements, photographs of an older woman with Claire's same soft eyes. And beneath the photographs, a folded letter in careful handwriting, not from Claire, but to her, from a nurse, describing a difficult week, describing how Claire's mother had called out for a husband who had been gone 11 years, how she had cried when no one came, how the staff had sat with her until she slept because there was no family close enough to come themselves. Ethan sat on the edge of that narrow bed, holding a photograph of a woman he had never met, and he thought of every morning Claire had set his coffee down with a warm smile before he had even asked for it, every late night she stayed without complaint, every small kindness she had extended to him while carrying a weight this enormous entirely alone. And he understood, with a shame that settled into his bones like cold water, that in 6 years he had never once asked her a single real question about her own life. He noticed, too, small things he had somehow never registered before. That her coat had a torn lining she had stitched closed herself rather than replace. That the heater in the apartment had been broken long enough for dust to settle on its dials, that there was exactly 1 plate, 1 cup, and 1 fork in the small kitchen, as though she had long ago stopped expecting to need more than that. When she woke in the hospital hours later, pale against white sheets, a fresh bandage at her shoulder, Ethan was already sitting beside her. And he did not ask about the merger files first. He asked her why she had never told him about her mother. Claire was quiet for a long moment before she answered, her voice thin but steady. "I did not want your pity," she said. "I wanted you to trust my work, not feel sorry for my life." And a man who had built his entire identity on being the smartest person in every room found he had no answer for that at all, because there was nothing intelligent about the way he had failed for 6 years to truly see her. It was only then, once the fear had drained enough to let her speak, that Claire told him what had actually happened. And the story came slowly, painfully, like a wound being cleaned. 3 weeks earlier, working late with wedding logistics with the Ashworth family's staff, she had noticed a small inconsistency in a shipping manifest connected to one of Ethan's overseas enterprises. Subsidiaries, the kind of tiny irregularity anyone else would dismiss, but Claire had spent 6 years learning that small things were often the only warning anyone gave you, and she kept digging quietly after hours, telling no one, until what she found nearly stopped her heart. The manifests were laundering money through a shell company controlled in careful layers by Senator Ashworth himself. And buried in the recovered emails was something far darker than fraud, proof that once the marriage secured Ethan's company its government contracts, his life insurance policy, recently and quietly increased at Victoria's insistence, would be worth considerably more to certain people if Ethan did not live to see his first wedding anniversary. And threaded through it all was a name that made Claire physically ill to read. Marcus Calloway, Ethan's own younger brother, who managed the family's private accounts and who stood to inherit control of the company entirely should something happen to Ethan before an heir was born. 2 nights before she vanished, a man she never got a clear look at had found her in the parking garage, left her with the wound in her shoulder, and told her that if she went to the police or to Ethan, she would not live long enough to warn anyone a second time.
So she had run, not to save herself, but to save the evidence, hiding in the one apartment no one from Ethan's world would ever think to search. She told him, quietly, what those 2 days had actually felt like, alone in the freezing dark, jumping at every creak of the floorboards above her, rationing a single can of soup she was too frightened to heat because the smell might carry into the hallway and give her away, pressing a folded towel against her shoulder each night because she did not dare go to a hospital where someone might find her name in a system, whispering her mother's name into the silence some nights just to hear a voice, even her own, and telling herself over and over that she only had to survive long enough to find one safe way to get the truth to him, that his life mattered more than her fear, even as her fever climbed and her hands grew too unsteady to hold a needle straight. She had thought more than once that she might not make it out of that apartment at all, and the thought that had frightened her most was not dying, but dying before anyone knew she had not betrayed him. Ethan sat in silence a long time after she finished, the hospital machines beeping softly, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough with something between grief and fury. "You could have died protecting me," he said, "and I let everyone believe you were a thief." Claire's eyes filled with tears then, the first she had allowed herself since the parking garage, and she said quietly that she never expected him to believe her, that she had only hoped, if she did not survive, someone would eventually find the truth and know she had not betrayed him. It was in that hospital room, morning light creeping through the blinds, that Ethan made the decision that would end one life and begin another. He called Victoria first, and when she answered, already bright and breathless about rehearsal dinner seating, he looked down at his own hands, still faintly stained despite the hospital soap, and told her in a voice that did not shake that the wedding was over, that he knew everything, and he turned the phone off before she could answer. The unraveling that followed was not gentle. There were federal investigators and lawyers, and the slow, painful work of dismantling a conspiracy that reached into his own family. And when Ethan finally sat across from Marcus in a small gray room with a single table between them, he did not open with accusation. He simply set down the folder of evidence and asked one question: why? Marcus stared at the folder for a long time before he looked up, and what was in his face was not defiance, but something worse, a kind of tired relief that it was finally over. "I used to sit in board meetings and watch you talk about the future of the company," Marcus said, his voice cracking, "and you never once asked what I thought, or what I wanted, or if I was even still in the room. Every decision was already made before I walked in. I told myself if something happened to you, at least someone would finally have to look at me, would finally have to say my name in the same breath as this company." Ethan sat with that for a long moment, feeling the truth of it settle over him like a weight he had been carrying without noticing. And when he spoke again, his voice had lost its fury entirely, replaced by something quieter and sadder. "I built a company so big, I stopped seeing the people standing right beside me," he said. "My assistant, my own brother. I am sorry it took almost losing everything to understand that." Marcus did not answer, only lowered his head, and Ethan left that room understanding that some betrayals come not from hatred, but from years of simply not being seen, a lesson that would follow him long after the trial ended and Marcus's sentencing had been reduced in exchange for his full cooperation, a mercy Ethan insisted on even when the lawyers advised against it. Senator Ashworth resigned before the indictment became public. Victoria disappeared from the city entirely, and the story that reached the papers was carefully managed to protect what could still be protected, though Ethan found, in the weeks that followed, that he cared far less than he once would have about what the papers said at all. The life he had spent 2 years constructing collapsed within a single week. Yet each evening, sitting beside Claire's hospital bed and watching her grow stronger, watching the color slowly return to her face and the fear slowly leave her eyes, he found that what remained standing after the collapse mattered more than anything that had fallen. On the day she was discharged, he did not take her home. He took her to Meadowbrook, and standing in the doorway of her mother's room, Claire watched Ethan Calloway, a man who had once measured his worth in shares and contracts, kneel slowly beside an elderly woman's wheelchair and introduce himself simply as a friend of her daughter's. For a long moment, her mother only stared past him, lost somewhere Ethan could not follow. And then, for one fragile, golden moment, her eyes cleared, sharp and present in a way Claire had not seen in months. And she reached out and patted his hand and said, in a voice thin as paper, "You take care of my girl. She works too hard and never rests." And Ethan, who had negotiated with senators and chief executives without ever once flinching, had to look away toward the window to hide that his eyes had filled with tears, because no one, not a single person in 20 years of boardrooms and mergers, had ever asked him for anything so simple or so important. He moved her mother to a better room that same week without telling Claire until it was already done, a room with a window that looked out over a small garden, and when she wept and said she could never repay him, he told her quietly that she had already saved his life twice, once from a knife in a parking garage and once from a marriage that would have ended it, and that some deaths were never meant to be repaid, only honored. Months later, on a quiet autumn afternoon with gold light falling across Central Park, Ethan found Claire sitting on the same bench where she used to eat lunch alone every day for 6 years, unnoticed by everyone who passed, and he sat down beside her without asking, because he had learned, finally, that the most important conversations begin not with a question, but with simply showing up. For a while, neither of them said anything at all, and the silence between them was not empty the way silences had once been, but full, the way silence is between two people who no longer need to fill every space with words. He did not make a speech, he only asked, quietly, the way he wished he had asked her 1,000 times before, "Are you truly all right?" And Claire, who had spent so many years being overlooked, felt something in her chest finally unclench, something she had been holding so long she had almost forgotten it was there. And she said, for the first time in longer than she could remember, yes. And for once, she meant it completely. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you of someone in your life who has carried a heavy burden in silence and never once asked for thanks, take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe to the Kind Soul Stories, because every single week we bring you one more true-hearted story about ordinary people who become extraordinary the moment someone finally chooses to see them. If you know someone who is quietly sacrificed for the people they love without ever asking for credit, send them this story today, because sometimes the smallest act of noticing someone is the very thing that saves them. This video is a work of fiction created for emotional and inspirational storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. This content complies with YouTube's fair use guidelines and has been developed with the assistance of AI writing tools alongside manual editing and creative direction intended purely for entertainment and reflective purposes.
The educational and emotional value in this story is its challenge to how we measure worth in the people around us. It reminds viewers that dedication, loyalty, and sacrifice are often invisible, carried quietly by people we see every day but rarely take the time to truly know. And it encourages a simple habit that costs nothing but attention, to ask the people closest to us, especially those who quietly serve or support us, whether they are truly all right, because their strength should never be mistaken for the absence of struggle.